Morning, Kathy.
Good morning, Senator Bray. I'm trying to get this onto the right screen.
We've had some of those struggles here this morning already, getting things onto the right screen.
We are live.
Thanks, Sue. Right, it is 11:30. Let me check in and see if we have an actual quorum present. I see, quote unquote, see Senator McDonald,
Oh, hang on.
Senator McCormick, Senator Westman, Senator Campion. There we are. Okay, good to go. Good morning, everyone. We're reconvening after a short break, and we're taking up Bill S-102, an act relating to the regulation of agricultural inputs for farming. We had a preliminary walkthrough and discussion in the committee yesterday to learn more about the bill, and we're following up today with a little more testimony and some questions. So because this involves management of food residuals, which has heretofore been part of all our solid waste work, and moving it to the Agency of Agriculture, wanted to make sure we heard directly from Ms. Jameson as the program manager for solid waste. So Ms. Jameson, could you talk to us about the thinking behind the change in jurisdiction from ANR to Agency of Agriculture? And it sounds, and I guess I'll start with a quick question. It's my understanding that DEC and ANR support S-102. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, great. Okay, so if you could talk to us a little bit about your agency's perspective on why that change seems like a good idea, that would be helpful to us. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. And for the record, I'm Kathy Jameson, the Solid Program Manager at DEC. And I'd like to start with just a couple minutes of a little bit of history of how we got here. So some of you might recall, it was about 10 years ago, we had a large stakeholder process over a 2-year period that discussed and decided jurisdiction of certain composting activities. And that was really to bring better clarity among the regulatory agencies of Act 250, ANR, and Agency of Ag. And at that point in time, about 10 years ago, with respect to food scraps being used as animal feed, we left that in the Agency of Ag jurisdiction, but it was not really written down anywhere. We had really good clarity about food scraps being composted, what threshold. DEC became the regulatory, had the regulatory jurisdiction over that. At that time, 10 years ago, we carved out, you all carved out some Act 250 exemptions for certain composting that occurred on farms. What we didn't put down in writing to have clarity about was what happens when food scraps are brought on a farm for animal feed. But we had a general understanding that that went with Agency of Ag. Then over time, we had the passage of the Universal Recycling Law. We had more food scraps being managed outside the landfill, which is a good thing. That was the whole purpose of the law. Some of those food scraps were being managed on farms. Some were managed at composting facilities that were not on farms. And some were being used for animal feed. And that tended to grow over time since the passage of the law in 2012. Then we fast forward to about 2018, an Agency of Ag was becoming concerned with the food scraps being used on farms. I don't want to put words in their mouth, but I felt like part of that was they felt like they didn't have the bandwidth, the resources for overseeing this activity. Since A&R already had a regulatory program, they determined that the importation of food scraps onto farms for these activities was not farming. And so they made it really clear at that point in time in 2018, they determined it wasn't farming. And so A&R looked at that as, okay, these are discarded materials. If it's not farming, then it really needs to come under our umbrella for regulatory oversight. The stakeholders were concerned because activity is deemed to be farming. Not only, it wasn't just that they were concerned about coming under A&R's jurisdiction, but there are certain benefits for being deemed farming. And those farmers that were using these materials for animal feed, they kind of felt like they were in a little bit of a limbo because, you know, if you had, you were feeding the chickens the food scraps, if you put like a hoop house or a structure on that, if it's not really, if the feeding of the food scraps isn't farming, then okay, is that more of a commercial activity? So, you know, what is then deemed commercial, what would, you know, versus farming. So we struggled with that. We worked with the stakeholders. They wanted to have more time to work with Agency of Ag to see if there was some middle ground. There was some proposed legislation, as you know. 2019, we had a summer study group. In 2020, there was legislation. It passed out of Senate Ag, but then COVID hit. And of course, you know, it was not a COVID related bill, so it didn't go anywhere. So that's a long story to, you know, to where we got to with this. Over this, after COVID hit, I think it was maybe over the summer, Agency of Ag developed a more comprehensive soil amendment fertilizer program. And so that's what you see in the bill. So the first portion of the bill is basically what passed out of Senate Ag last year. It would basically allow Agency of Ag jurisdiction over two types of composting on farms. One would be, and they're both up to 2,000 cubic yards. That's not a magic number. That's a number from our solid waste rules that up to that is considered a small composting operation. So if you're still under that small threshold and you principally use the compost product on your farm, which means 50% or more, then that would then go to Agency of Ag. Or if you have poultry management on your farm, then that activity would fall into Agency of Ag. So it's those two operations. And just so you know, in about 10 years ago, when they carved out the Act 250 exceptions, they did have those two, but it was in the definition of development. You know how Act 250 defines what development is, so exempted it under that. And I think what this bill does, the one before you, would declare that as farming and exempt it that way. So moving the jurisdiction to Agency of Ag with this broader picture where Agency of Ag can have better oversight of multiple soil amendments that are used agriculturally with the fees that are in this bill, allows Ag to have resources that they didn't have in 2018 to have that oversight of not just composting on farm, but of the other items in the bill. And I don't want to get too far beyond my role, which is with A&R. So I don't wish to kind of get into the nitty gritty of the Agency of Ag proposal, but we are supportive of that proposal. We worked with Agency of Ag to make sure it was clear and added language that we A&R proposed, as far as making sure it was clear that if materials from solid waste, composting facilities that are still under solid waste jurisdiction, or further treated biosolids are used non-agriculturally, that still is retained under DEC's jurisdiction, and ag would have the jurisdiction when those things are, those materials are used agriculturally. We thought that that was a really good jurisdictional line to draw and be clear on. So what this bill does is provide jurisdictional clarity to the stakeholders who felt like things were changed on them in 2018, as well as better oversight of multiple materials that are used agriculturally. So DEC is supportive of the bill as it was passed out of Senate Ag.
Right. So a quick, from our point of view, we're always looking at impacts on, soil in terms of, any kind of, if we're creating any issues around practices that could bring residuals to any location that would might have heavy metals or other materials that need to be managed with care. So are you satisfied that on that side of what's going to show up on these farms, that the testing regimen is one, sufficient, and two, no less rigorous than what A&R would do if it were managing the program?
Yes, for two reasons. One is there's a provision in this bill that says that these composting operations have to meet the solid waste rules until such time that the Agency of Ag adopts their own rules. And of course, that's a public process, rulemaking, as you know, more than I do, and that we would have the ability to make sure any new rules were protective in a variety of conditions, for a variety of different aspects of managing these materials. That's the first reason. And the second is this bill, is my understanding, is that when soil amendments are used agriculturally, and not just composting soil amendments, but a variety of other types of materials, they will need to meet standards that the Agency of Ag can set.
Okay. All right. And I think part of what's behind my questions is that when I'm not sure that it was a wise choice when the state split water, which is held in common by all people and flows across all property lines, into management by agriculture as for on farms, and all the rest of the state was A&R. And we're just trying to make sure that, and we've talked about this, ag has both a promotion and a regulatory function, and that's a difficult position to put any single entity into. And we're trying to make sure that we don't end up with a promoter and a regulator struggling a little bit to manage in the same way that A&R would around impacts on soils, impact on water. So that's what we're really trying to check in on here.
Right. So I'm not sure I would, and I mean this nicely, but I don't think I would categorize Agency of Ag as a promoter of how our food scraps are being managed. But I think they see that there is value in certainly composting these materials and using them properly. But I don't,
I meant, sorry,
advocating for diversion from the landfill is what I mean by that.
Yeah,
right. That's more A&R's role, is that we want to decrease the amount of materials being landfilled, and that's not really a goal of the Agency of Ag. That's what I mean by that statement.
Right, sure. And I wasn't very clear. I meant that they promote agricultural enterprises.
Mhm.
And so there are instances where regulation can be seen by people in any business as an impediment to operating the way they would like to. Sometimes there's an increased cost of compliance or something like that.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah,
Senator,
and oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Senator McCormick has a question
Yeah,
for you.
thanks. Just could you articulate what is the problem with ANR having jurisdiction over something it usually has jurisdiction over? Why is that a problem
Mhm.
for your people?
Yeah, two things with that. So up until 2018, DEC we didn't think we had jurisdiction over this activity. And so, and with that, and I'm not articulating this very well, but there are certain other benefits to being considered farming. So one would be farm structures. My understanding is if a structure is used on a farm for farm purposes, then that has a certain benefit than if it's more of a commercial structure. And that there are, and I think, maybe people from Agency of Ag could better articulate, some of the benefits there are for an activity being determined farming. I don't know if current, and this is not my area of expertise, but I think it might impact current use. And there are,
The advantage of being agricultural in that case is the not being under Act 250 jurisdiction is the main advantage, right?
mhm.
Advantage.
Well,
I'm not sure it is.
yeah. In these two activities, 10 years ago, were granted Act 250 exemptions up to the 2,000 cubic yards. I think this bill makes it more clear that it is considered farming rather than just not development.
Well, the agricultural exemption that goes back, I think, to 1969. It's part of how Act 250 was written.
Wow.
It was
Mhm.
probably more. It was a political. It was necessary to get the votes to pass the bill.
Mhm.
I wasn't there. That's my understanding.
Mhm.
Okay.
Sure.
Senator McDonald?
I've listened several times where this is unusual that both the Department of Agriculture, the Agency of Agriculture, and the Agency of Environmental have agreed that it's a better fit for them to make this switch. I mean, that seems to be what they're saying. And if I'm correct, that makes sense. Then when we get to the issue of development review, that sort of is a trailer that gets dragged along with the switch. And if it is in fact, the reason for this proposal is that they are better suited to do a more efficient job, why can't we agree and allow them to make the switch, but not drag along behind them something that they say is incidental and not part of the goal? And I'm sitting here looking out the window in downtown Montpelier, in the middle of city blocks at chickens, and across the fence in the next yard. Why can we not make the switch and say, but as a result of this switch, we are not imposing a change on zoning regulations or the effect of local zoning in our municipalities, just as a byproduct of a more efficient administration of the health and safety rules. Would the parties, the Agency of Agriculture and the Agency of Environmental, or Natural Resources Environmental Protection, say, no, we were just trying to be more efficient in the jurisdiction. It wasn't part of our goal, nor do we require or support the change in zoning and exemptions that would take place otherwise.
I think
we
that
have
goes a
a-
little bit beyond
and-
my jurisdiction. You know, A&R, we usually don't get into the zoning, the local zoning issue. I'll leave that for others.
Well,
Leaving that means you don't want the zoning issue to change, or you're perfectly happy to have it change.
Well, I think that comes along when you call something farming. And so is feeding, it's the bigger question is feeding, you know, food scraps to chickens farming? And that's the question you're being asked. And from where I sit, there's these operations are a bit different from the other operations that we have regulatory oversight of. And so it probably does make better sense for the Agency of Agriculture to have that jurisdiction of oversight, especially when with this proposal, the Agency of Agriculture would have a better, more comprehensive program to address multiple types of soil amendments that can and are being used in farms.
My question is predicated on understanding what you've just said as being worthwhile and moving forward. So my question says, if we believe it's worthwhile, then moving forward with it for the reasons that you have set forth, are we also going to drag behind it the exemptions that show up from Act 250 or pursuant to zoning? Do you
right.
insist, be inclined to support, think it makes sense to drag it along behind, or that was not part of your proposal?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by the drag behind. These two activities they basically already had Act 250 exemption. What the bill does, in my understanding of it, is that it brings clarity that this activity will basically continue to be viewed as farming. It was until recently. Agency of Ag had made the determination in 2018 that did bring some vagueness or uncertainty of regulatory jurisdiction. We thought that meant that it needed to come under Agency of Ag. If we clarify that jurisdiction.
So, Senator McDonald, I appreciate the line of questions, and I think we want to be able to get to it. I think probably because they're in part of a legal nature, we should maybe check in with Commissioner Walk or Mr. Chapman as counsel, in terms of like the legal position around Act 250.
Even leaving Act, I was just asking about zoning.
Right.
I didn't gotten into Act 250. So.
Well, you're right. So let me interpret on behalf of Ms. Jameson, who's very capable of saying this herself. But what I'm hearing is she's been working with people concentrating on what are the practices on the ground to have it well executed, regardless of sort of the context, like what are the impacts on zoning, planning, Act 250, which are all valid questions, especially for our committee.
I'd like to get that question answered, and I thank Ms. Jameson for helping us see what's before us, and maybe we'll find the answer somewhere else. Thank you. Thank you witness very much.
Thank you. And we will. So I'll reach out to ANR and Ag to see if we can get the people who've addressed this question in the room with us tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you. And And with that, I wanted to go to Mr. LaRosa. I'm sorry that we are running a little short on time, but you can get a lot done in a short period of time with this committee. So dive right in, please.
Great, thank you, and thank you, Kathy. You actually helped clear up some of the questions that I have with regard to this bill. My name is Steve LaRosa. I'm here as a private citizen. I think on the agenda it had my company listed, but I'm not representing my company or any of our clients. I live at 2012 Main Street in Montpelier, and directly adjacent to one of the larger and more established composting locations, which uses chickens as a method of performing their food scrap, food waste handling. I've been living there for about 20 years. I was a part of some of the reasoning why the 10-year ago regulations were discussed regarding what is composting and what is not, and have been struggling on a daily basis ever since with regard to how food scraps and food waste is handled, and the complete and utter lack of any regulatory responses or authority regarding that handling, and navigating through what is acceptable practices, what is not an acceptable practice, what is farming, what is not farming. So these conversations with regard to food scrap composting have been going on for over a decade. So just as a way of laying this out, I am an environmental scientist. I do a lot of work with landfills and hazardous waste sites. And I would like to bring things back to what it is that are being handled here, and that's organics and food scraps. I think Kathy would likely agree with me that on a day-to-day basis, the most difficult items to handle, the most costly management that a landfill has is food scraps. They have to deal with odors, they have to deal with vectors, birds, rats, other vermin on a daily basis. Until the food scraps were diverted up at Coventry, they were spending nearly $250,000 a year just trying to handle the bird population. And the birds are there for the organics. Obviously, they're there for food. Now, another downside, and a huge downside of organics coming into a landfill, is obviously the landfill gas they create, and the methane, and the space they take up, and all the reasons why we rightfully and appropriately have diverted those from the landfill. I fully and wholeheartedly agree that removing organics from the landfill waste stream is a #1 priority for all of the reasons that I just listed, and just because it takes up less space. We can utilize our landfill for the things that should be there for a much longer period of time. So I agree that organics need to be diverted, and that composting is a great option. If we had a smaller state and a lot more organics in a smaller place, anaerobic digestion would be great. We could make energy out of these things and not have the greenhouse gases. But my main point is that food waste is very, very difficult to manage on a day-to-day basis because of all these vectors and things that come into play. And those are the things that have really impacted me and my family on a day-to-day basis for 20 years now. This started back when this facility had 200 chickens and less than an acre worth of composting area. They now have anywhere from 700 to 2,000 chickens, and the actual area that they're making compost is nearly 10 acres. None of it is under Act 250, where they bring these food scraps. We have had to talk with Act 250. The city of Montpelier had to bring a health ordinance letter to this facility. We've dealt with Kathy Jameson's group. We've dealt with enforcement. We've dealt with the Department of Ag. And at no point have I not had food scraps being dropped onto my front yard, crows in my trees, and odors of rotting dairy products every single day for the last 20 years. This facility has done nothing but get bigger. There's, to Senator McDonald's question, Montpelier views all of his operations as farming. The most current development there is a 35-foot tall embankment of compost and organic materials made of pallets and trees and compost that isn't quite ready for sale, that's within 10 feet of the main street that drives by. It's 35 feet tall, but is farming, according to the city and according to apparently the regulatory entities that I've brought this to. So becoming farming, this kind of composting, the food handling, becoming farming will have a significant impact on the ability to regulate, my ability and the neighbor's ability to have some sort of actionable items happen here. The odors are constant, but I've never been able to get anybody to come and even look at what are the odors. Are they an issue? The crows, the rats that I catch on my property now. All of this is a non-issue apparently for the regulators, or falls into this area between ag and the DEC. There's constantly for 20 years been a question of who should be regulating this? Where does it fall? So those impacts that we've had, as I said, are daily, and they are all the time. If you're in Montpelier, please drive up Main Street towards the Morse Farm to grab a creamy, and you can see what's happening out there and how this development has happened. And
Mr. LaRosa, sorry to interrupt, quick question. Are we talking about the Vermont Compost Company?
yes,
Yes. Okay.
yes. Now, some of my biggest concerns, I mean, I'm not going to opine as to whether feeding food scraps to chickens is actually feeding the chickens. The descriptions that I've seen the owner of Vermont Compost give on the internet and other testimony is that the birds don't really eat the food. It's the bugs and organisms that they generate in the compost that the chickens primarily eat. As I said, back in 2000, he claimed that his chickens did not get fed any grain, and they brought in several hundred cubic yards of food waste. At this time, they bring in at least 4,000 tons of food waste and have 700 chickens. If the chickens were actually eating the food waste, they'd have to weigh 300 pounds apiece. There's the amount of food waste that's come in is 10 to 50 times higher than what he claimed previously was sufficient to sustain his animals. So I've seen a lot of actions that to me appear to be a way to avoid being regulated outside of agriculture. This is why the chickens are there. I drive by Grow Compost every day on my way to work. They, for a while, did not have chickens and were under the DEC's purview. and had to have their permits. When their initial permit came up, they got a few dozen chickens, were now farming and no longer had to follow those rules. It seems like a slippery slope. If you drive by this facility next to my house, you will see what can happen there. So some of the things in this bill that really, and I don't want to harp on all those things, but some of the things in this bill that really are concerning to me, that I can see through the history that I've had as being an avenue to try and nibble away at what is deemed acceptable in agriculture, is principally used on the farm. I believe that there's probably 5,000 to 8,000 cubic yards of compost that has been used as fill to elevate this property. It's not being used on the farm as an additive for arable soils, to grow vegetables, to grow anything. It is just fill. I have water coming onto my property from 5-foot embankments that are 3 feet from my property line that are compost and put on the property. So what is principally used? Principally used as what on the farm? My other concern is this exemption for produced on a small farm that manages and raises poultry. That means that you can take in up to 4,000 tons of food waste, have 20 chickens, and thereby be exempt from any of the DEC regulations.
Mr. Chairman, may I interrupt briefly? I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Mr.
Yeah.
LaRosa, I have to apologize. I am very late for a promise I made to be at another meeting at noon. Your testimony is compelling and disturbing, and I take it to heart. I get the general drift of what you're saying, and I have not been ignoring you, and I really apologize, but I have
No,
to.
there's no need to. We all have more things to handle than we can on our plate.
Yeah. Okay.
The end of my story is I would really like the DEC to continue to regulate this activity, because they're set up to regulate food waste and all of the problems that come with it.
I got it.
Thank you.
Apologies.
So,
Chair, I'm afraid that I too, it's.
yeah,
You
but-
bet.
I apologize to the committee. We try not to run over, and we are 7 minutes over, and it's a packed day. Mr. LaRosa, so
Absolutely. I'll be
Thank
happy
you.
to provide a brief summary of what
Right.
I would like to have considered.
that's just what I was going to
to
ask for.
Jude.
Thank you.
And I do appreciate you guys taking some extra time to let me talk, and good luck with the rest of the session.
Okay, thank you for coming in, and sorry that we're a little tight on time. We'll look forward to getting your document. That will be helpful.
No worries. Great. Thanks.